Before we dive into this gripping story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a powerful story like this one. Now, let's begin. The night was cold, the streets dimly lit, and the distant hum of the city's heartbeat pulsed through the quiet highway. Second Lieutenant Darius Cole, a disciplined and decorated officer in the Royal Army, was driving home after a long shift at the barracks. His uniform was neatly pressed, metals gleaming under the soft glow of the dashboard lights. A sense of pride filled him as he thought of his service, protecting and defending a nation he had sworn loyalty to. But in just a matter of minutes, that pride would be tested in the most humiliating way possible. As he cruised down Riverdale Highway, the rhythmic sound of tires against asphalt was suddenly interrupted by the unmistakable blare of a police siren. Red and blue lights painted the dark road behind him. He frowned, quickly checking his speedometer. 45 mph per hour. Right within the speed limit. His seatbelt was on. His license and registration? In his glove compartment. So why was he being pulled over? A cold feeling crept into his chest. Something wasn't right. Darius had been in uniform all day, but the reality of his black skin meant that even his military rank couldn't protect him from suspicion. He had heard the stories before, too many of them, and now it was happening to him. He knew the golden rule: stay calm, keep your hands visible, comply. Taking a deep breath, he signaled and pulled over into an empty gas station lot, parking under the bright security lights. His heart pounded as he rolled down his window, placing both hands firmly on the wheel. The officer approached aggressively, his hand resting on his holstered firearm. "Step out of the vehicle," the cop barked. Darius didn't move. "Sir, can I ask why I'm being stopped?" His voice was steady, respectful. "Step out of the car, now!" the cop shouted again, his tone sharp and commanding. Darius's breath caught in his throat. He had faced dangerous situations before, but this felt different. What was happening? Why was this officer so agitated? And then, before he could react, a sudden burst of liquid fire engulfed his face. Pepper spray. Pain. Blinding, unbearable pain. Darius screamed, his hands flying to his face as his vision blurred. The fiery chemical burned his eyes, his skin, his throat. His uniform, the very symbol of his service, was now soaked in humiliation. And as he gasped for air, stumbling back, one thought echoed in his mind: is this justice? This is just the beginning of a shocking, real-life-inspired story that exposes the flaws in our system, the dangers of prejudice, and the importance of justice and respect. Stay tuned for part 2. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. Darius stumbled backward, his breath ragged, his face on fire. The pepper spray was relentless, searing his eyes, nose, and throat. It felt like 1,000 needles stabbing his skin, his lungs burning as if he were suffocating from the inside out. He had been trained for combat, endured grueling drills, survived the worst conditions in the field. But nothing prepared him for this. His uniform, the very thing that should have commanded respect, was now a cruel irony, a shield turned useless in the face of injustice. The officer's voice cut through the haze of pain. "Get on the ground! Hands behind your back!" Darius coughed, struggling to breathe. His hands flailed in the air, an instinctive reaction to the blinding agony. He wasn't resisting. He wasn't fighting. He was just trying to see. "I can't see," he gasped, his voice raw. "Please." Bam! A hard shove sent him crashing onto the cold pavement. His knees scraped against the rough asphalt, pain shooting through his legs. Another officer had arrived. He could hear the heavy boots stomping toward him. The weight of a knee pressed into his back, forcing him flat against the ground. Darius tried to remain calm, but panic gripped his chest. This wasn't just an arrest. This was something else. This was humiliation. He felt hands grabbing at his wrists, yanking them behind his back. The metal clink of handcuffs followed, the cold steel biting into his skin. He wanted to scream. Not from the pain, but from the sheer injustice of it all. He had done nothing wrong. He was an officer of the Royal Army, a man who had sworn to protect this very country. And yet, here he was, face down, cuffed, blinded, treated like a criminal. Inside the patrol car, his head still throbbing, Darius sat in silence. His hands were shaking, his chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven breaths. His heart wasn't just pounding from fear, it was pounding from rage. Rage at the system. Rage at the lack of respect. Rage at how, even in uniform, he was still just another black man in the eyes of these officers. No questions, no explanations, just brutality first, humanity second. He clenched his fists. This couldn't be where his story ended. No, this was just the beginning. Before we continue, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the next part of this powerful story. Now, let's get back into it. Darius sat in the back of the patrol car, his wrists aching from the tight handcuffs. His eyes were still burning, his vision blurred. He could barely make out the two officers standing outside, talking in hushed voices. The first officer, Sergeant Daniel Brooks, was the one who had pulled him over, the one who had pepper-sprayed him without warning. The second officer, Corporal Ryan Carter, had arrived only moments later. And now, Carter was trying to make sense of what had just happened. Brooks spoke first, his voice low but firm. He refused to comply, resisted arrest. Carter frowned, glancing back at Darius, who sat slumped against the seat, blinking rapidly. His uniform, soaked from the pepper spray, clung to his skin. "He's military?" Carter asked, squinting at the badge on Darius's chest. Brooks scoffed. "Yeah, so what? Doesn't put him above the law." Carter hesitated. Something felt off. The way Darius sat there, barely able to hold himself up, didn't match the picture of a man who had resisted arrest. But Brooks was his partner. They had worked together for years. If he said the guy resisted, then that was the story. Carter exhaled and reached for his radio. "Dispatch, we have a suspect in custody." Inside the car, Darius's head spun with anger and disbelief. Resisted arrest? He had barely moved. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. There were no witnesses, no cameras, no bystanders, just his word against theirs. And he knew how that usually ended. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. This was not just about him anymore. This was about every black man who had ever been treated like less than human. About every soldier who had risked their life for a country that still saw them as a threat rather than a protector. He refused to let this go. "I want my lawyer." His voice was hoarse but steady. Brooks turned, his expression darkening. "You'll get one when we're done with you." Carter glanced at his partner but said nothing. He had seen Brooks get aggressive before, but something about this didn't sit right. Still, loyalty came first. He sighed and got into the driver's seat. The car pulled away, leaving behind the gas station's bright lights. Darius swallowed hard. He had spent years defending his country. Now he had to defend himself. The patrol car rumbled through the empty streets, the city lights flickering past like ghosts. Darius sat in the back, his hands still cuffed behind him, his wrists burning. His eyes were swollen from the pepper spray, his vision still clouded, but his mind was sharper than ever. He had been trained for high-pressure situations, in war, in chaos, in the unknown. But this was different. Because here, there were rules, and yet, those rules had been ignored. He knew the protocol. Officers were required to turn on their body cameras during traffic stops. But something told him that Brooks's camera had been off the whole time. No proof, no witnesses, and no justice unless he fought for it. He took a slow, deep breath. He needed to stay calm. He needed to think. At the front of the car, Officer Carter stole a glance at the rearview mirror. Darius's uniform was unmistakable, even in the dim light. Royal Army, active duty, a man who had likely seen more danger than both officers combined. Carter had only heard Brooks's version of events. He had arrived to find a man on the ground, barely able to see, and Brooks yelling that he had resisted. But something wasn't adding up. Why would a trained military officer resist a routine traffic stop? Why did Brooks look too calm for someone who had just used force? Carter had worked the streets long enough to know when something felt wrong, and this felt wrong. He cleared his throat. "Brooks, was your body cam on?" Silence. Brooks didn't answer right away. Instead, he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. Then he shrugged. "Battery died." Carter's stomach tightened, the oldest excuse in the book. Darius heard their conversation, his ears trained on every word. No body cam, no footage. They could say whatever they wanted, and there would be no way to prove otherwise. His anger simmered, but he refused to let it boil over. Anger wouldn't help him now. Strategy would. He shifted slightly in his seat, wincing as the handcuffs bit into his skin. His military training had taught him one important lesson. Always have a plan. He didn't need proof. He didn't need cameras. He just needed one thing: doubt. If he could make Carter doubt Brooks, if he could force a crack in their story, then maybe, just maybe, he could shift the odds in his favor. He licked his dry lips and spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Officer Carter, do you believe in justice?" The car fell silent. Carter looked into the mirror again, locking eyes with Darius. There was something in his gaze, something unshaken, something unafraid. And for the first time that night, Carter wasn't sure whose side he was really on. Before we dive into this shocking part of the story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you can stay up to date with every twist and turn. Now, let's jump right back in. The tension in the patrol car was palpable, thick enough that Darius could almost taste it. His words had landed, and Carter's eyes shifted nervously in the rearview mirror. The question he had posed, "Do you believe in justice?" hung in the air, unanswered. Carter's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He was a seasoned officer. He had seen things, done things. But this felt different. Officer Brooks, who had been driving in silence, finally spoke up, his voice cutting through the thickening atmosphere. "He's playing games. Don't listen to him, Carter." Brooks's tone was sharp, a hint of nervousness in his words. It wasn't a tone Carter had ever heard before from his partner, the man who had always been so confident, so sure. Carter turned his gaze fully to Brooks. "I'm not listening to anyone. I'm thinking." For a moment, there was a dead silence. Darius knew this was his moment. This was his chance to make Carter see. He took a slow breath, trying to stay composed despite the fire that burned in his chest. "You think I'm resisting, don't you?" Darius's voice cut through the air, low but filled with undeniable authority. "You think I'm just another criminal, but you know what I am?" He paused, letting the words hang in the air for a heartbeat. "I'm a soldier. I fight for this country. I swore an oath to protect and serve, not just for the people who wear badges, but for everyone, even for people like you who don't see me as a human." Carter felt the weight of the words as if they were pushing down on his chest. Soldier. The word struck him deeply. He had heard it 1,000 times before, but coming from this man, in this moment, it sounded different. Darius wasn't just a victim of a traffic stop. He was a warrior, a protector, and the system, his own brothers in blue, had turned on him. Carter turned his head slightly, just enough to meet Darius's eyes in the mirror. "What's your name, soldier?" "Lieutenant Darius Williams." His voice was steady now, calm but unwavering. Brooks shot Carter a glare, his teeth grinding together in frustration. "Carter, are you listening to this nonsense?" But Carter's mind was elsewhere. He had been trained to trust the badge, to trust his fellow officers. But what if this time it wasn't right? He had witnessed the way Darius's eyes held his gaze, the sincerity, the desperation. "I didn't resist," Darius said again, his words measured, his voice clear despite the pain. "I just want to be treated with respect." Carter took a deep breath. At that moment, the car came to a stop in front of the precinct. Brooks got out first, slamming the door behind him with a force that seemed out of place for someone who had just used excessive force. Carter stayed in his seat for a moment longer, his hand resting on the door handle. Was this really just about disobedience? Or was there something deeper, something that didn't have an easy answer? He opened the door slowly, stepping out of the car. Inside the precinct, the officers were quickly processing the paperwork, each following the standard procedure. Brooks had already written up the report, claiming that Darius had been non-compliant and needed to be restrained. But Carter wasn't so sure anymore. He hadn't seen the same things Brooks had. And the more he thought about it, the more his mind unraveled the moment. Something about the way Brooks had acted during the stop, something about his urgency, the coldness in his eyes, didn't sit right. Back in the holding room, Darius could hear the officers talking. He could feel the walls closing in, but he wasn't going to let them get away with this. He refused to be silenced. A few minutes later, Carter entered the room, his face hard to read. He walked straight up to Darius, his footsteps echoing in the silence. "Lieutenant Williams," he said, his voice quieter than before, "I need you to tell me what happened." Darius exhaled, finally able to speak without pain burning his throat. "I was stopped for a simple traffic violation. I complied. I gave my ID. But when I questioned why I was being treated the way I was, that's when it escalated. Carter listened carefully. He didn't speak at first, and Darius could feel the officer's gaze on him. Finally, Carter asked the one question that mattered. Do you believe in justice? Before we wrap up this powerful story, subscribe and like this video if you believe in justice, and comment if you believe officers like Carter still exist today. Now, let's bring this to a close. Carter stood in the dimly lit holding room, his eyes locked with Darius's, the tension in the air palpable. The walls seemed to close in around them, but in that moment, the truth was clear. The question was no longer what had happened during the stop. The question was what was going to happen now. For the next few days, the internal investigation began. Carter filed a report, detailing everything he had seen, the way Brooks had acted, the inconsistencies in his story, and the lack of body camera footage. The department was forced to open a full inquiry, though many of the officers within the precinct were reluctant to speak against one of their own. But Carter had made up his mind. It didn't take long for Brooks's history to come under scrutiny. There were complaints from past encounters, whispers of racial profiling, and excessive force. Brooks had always managed to slide under the radar, his charm and ability to avoid cameras keeping him untouchable. Until now. Darius, meanwhile, refused to back down. He knew that if he didn't fight, the system would sweep this under the rug, just like it had for so many others. He worked with his attorney, building a case based on the lack of evidence, the missing body cam footage, and most importantly, the testimonies of others who had witnessed Brooks's past behavior. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the truth, about justice for everyone who had ever been wronged. As the days passed, Brooks continued to deny any wrongdoing. He stuck to his version of events, claiming that Darius had resisted, that he had been in fear for his safety, and that the use of force was justified. But the pieces didn't fit. Internal witnesses began to step forward, and whistleblowers within the department came forward, revealing Brooks's history of abuse. One by one, the walls he had built began to crumble. The final blow came when the department reviewed the dashcam footage of the traffic stop. Although it hadn't caught the actual altercation, it revealed something important. The officers had been on the scene for far longer than they had claimed. Brooks had been in direct communication with Darius for several minutes before escalating the situation. There was no sign of any resistance, only calm, respectful conversation until the moment Brooks chose to use force. The truth had finally surfaced. Brooks was placed on administrative leave during the investigation, and within a week, he was fired. The department made it clear that no one, not even one of their own, was above the law. For Darius, the victory was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the scars remained. He had always believed in the system, but that belief had been shaken. As he stood outside the precinct, the light from the rising sun casting long shadows on the pavement, he knew he had made a difference. He had stood up not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been mistreated, misunderstood, or forgotten. The respect he had always earned in his uniform, the honor he had fought for, had been momentarily stripped away. But in the end, he had fought for justice, and that was something no one could take from him. "Lieutenant Williams," Carter said, approaching Darius one last time. There was a hint of regret in his voice, but also something more, a respect that had grown through the ordeal. "I know this doesn't change what happened, but I want you to know, I was wrong. You didn't deserve any of that." Darius gave him a small nod, his eyes hard but understanding. "I know, Officer Carter, but it's not just about me. It's about the bigger picture." As Darius walked away from the precinct, the weight of the world felt lighter. He had stood his ground, he had fought for respect, and in the end, he had won. The lesson of this story is clear. Justice is not always easy to come by, but it is worth fighting for. Whether you're in uniform or not, you deserve respect. And it is our duty as a society to ensure that we treat each other with dignity and fairness, no matter the color of our skin or the uniform we wear. If you believe that justice, respect, and honor still have a place in our world, subscribe. Let's work together to ensure that everyone is treated equally and fairly.